Well, this is a day of celebration for the life and work of Dr. James Matthew Wilson. Now, I'm going to list the categories that I feel describe him. They're long. A poet, a literary critic, a scholar, a political philosopher, a teacher, a cultural critic, and may I also add a theologian. I also want to add these: a son, a brother, a husband, a father, and how powerful these roles are today. So I just had to add those. Now, how amazing that this relatively young man has achieved so much in such a short time. This award is designed to be given to one who's not yet reached the fullness of acclaim. And certainly it's true of Professor Wilson, even though his accomplishments to date would astonish the most seasoned scholar. My sense, after reading his books and listening to his talks on the internet, is that he has just begun to soar. His is a powerful message. Now, why is his work so important at this particular time? Well, these are dark times. The recent mass shooting in the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs has brought us to our knees. And only 5 weeks following the worst massacre in the United States. So culturally, we are alarmed. And we're bewildered. What is happening to our culture? How is it we've lost those basic principles of decency and respect of each other? Where is our moral compass? Well, these are the questions being addressed by James Wilson. He says of his own mission, "I've sought to serve as an advocate for poetry, for art, for literature, and for the integrity of the intellectual, religious, and political life in general." He believes there is a moral compass, and his work is to guide us toward it. His facts about him right now: he earned an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in English literature and Irish studies from Notre Dame. He began his tenure at Villanova University, where he's currently associate professor of religion and literature, and he's a prolific writer. He published in 2014 his book of poetry. Now, I think you have it, many of you have it, but if you don't, you need to buy it today. Some Permanent Things. And I want to add that he dedicated this book to his 3 children, Livia Grace, James Augustine, and Thomas Avery. I just love these things. I just love it. And then the following year, in 2015, he published The Fortunes of Poetry in an Age of Unmaking. He dedicated that book to his daughter who had been born that year, Cecilia Ray. And just this year, in 2017, appeared his elegant book, The Vision of the Soul: Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition. So you start to get a sense of who this person is. Now, this is my question. How does it happen that there could be a young man? Where does he come from? How did he get to be this kind of human being? So I want to read to you just 12 lines from his book of poetry. This is from his verse letter to my father. And I had to go over and just a few minutes ago and meet his father. I want you to get the scene. Here he is, our honoree. He's sitting at a desk somewhere, and he's writing a letter to his father. He's remembering something from his childhood, something his father is doing for him, something he's making for him. Now, before I read these lines, I want to say that the adult man is remembering a passage of words from Jacques Maritain. Many of you know his work. And he writes this as a little forward frontispiece. The artisan, in the normal type of human development, represents the general run of man. If Christ willed to be an artisan in a little village, it is because he wanted to assume the common condition of humanity. He's thinking of his father, and he's recalling these words from Jacques Maritain. Now, here are the first lines in his book of poetry. Verse, letter to my father. You will remember better than I can the mealy smells of wood chips, earth-chilled concrete, and laundry from the other room, which crept into your basement workshop, and the long, neat pile of timber laid out for my desk. Over the course of my 6th year, you built it, towering wide with bookshelf drawers and cabinets, and carved the front with gratuitous leafy frills, as any old woodworker would have done. As if the dead planks from an unknown tree should own as artificial scars the forms they would in nature bear, but never be. Now, Mr. Wilson, would you just raise your hand? Okay, raise your hand. All right. That desk that you built for your son when he was in the 6th grade has become an ark for truth, goodness, and beauty in our culture. What a beautiful thing. Now, I'm particularly grateful to have been invited to be a judge in the selection of the Hiett Prize, and I simply want to say there were many, many qualified applicants, but when we read the full dossier of his application, everything stopped, came to an abrupt halt, and our work had been achieved. And on a personal level, I experienced at that moment, I have to say, a coming home again because of the beauty of Wilson's language, the understanding of literature as a mode of knowledge, references to W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Jacques Maritain, Dante, Homer. These were the foundational teachings of our beloved teachers, Dr. Louise Cowan and Dr. Donald Cowan. And because of their enlightened vision of what is possible to achieve in a culture seeking truth and beauty, we were emboldened to start the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. So welcome home, Dr. Wilson, and congratulations.
I was not prepared for that. In fact, I'm still taking it in. Thank you so much. That was far kinder than what I expected. When I heard that the Hiett Prize was the opposite of a Lifetime Achievement Award, I thought, what are you trying to say? I'm so glad that it turned out to be this. This is much better. Thank you for being here today. I was overwhelmed when I received word that I would be getting this award this year, and the excitement has just continued to build, and now I'm just overwhelmed with joy and gratitude. Gratitude to Kim Hiett Jordan for making this award possible, to the Dallas Institute, and to Dr. Allums. It sounds like everybody calls you Dr. Larry, but I want to also thank my colleagues and my students in the Department of Humanities and Augustinian Traditions at Villanova University. Like most scholars, I began my career just hoping I could get out alive, and they have made my work a time of flourishing and joy and conversion. I also want to thank my family. As you hear, they're here. That was really quite a surprise. I'm so thrilled to have them here today. And I'm grateful for what they have done, as Gail suggested, to make this day possible. And then I have to thank also my wife, Hillary, who, true to form, is not here today, because she's home with our 4 children. But her love and sacrifice has done, for them and for me, has done so much to make this possible. And I'll tell you, I don't hesitate to tell you, sometimes that's shown forth when I say, I sure am glad I married you, because nobody else could have tolerated me. So in many ways, she shares in this prize. And I want to offer her thanks, or thanks on her behalf also, to Kim Hiett and Jordan and to the Dallas Institute. I've been asked to say a few words, maybe a little more than a few words, about my work today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do so. I hope it'll, in some ways, sum up some of those things that Gail was referring to, and pray God will make some sense of them. You could sum up everything I'm going to say today in 5 words: form, being, truth, goodness, and beauty. If the after-lunch malaise is upon you, just pull out a bingo card with those words conveniently labeled on it and just put your token down. But please, if you get bingo over the course of my remarks, just say it quietly, or something may go wrong up here. Indulge me, if you will, in recalling a scene 2 decades ago, nearly so anyhow. I was in my first year of doctoral work and was studying at home on a bright Sunday afternoon. I found myself reflecting on all I've been learning about the political history of modern Europe, the making of modern literature, and conversely, the troubling ease with which it seemed one could dissolve those literary works back into the political and historical ferment from which they had come, as if that was their meaning. What did I come here to study? I asked myself. I wanted to write poems. I'd already written some. I was committed to, reverent before. I wanted to practice the craft of poetry, its traditions and techniques, the rigor of a meter that brings measure and order to human speech, of rhyme with its illogical but striking reasons, and of every other aspect of the art comprehended under the name of form. In reading a poem, we see easily enough how the elements converge to make something that is separate, a new whole that takes its place in the world and has an integrity that belongs to it by itself. We see also that we can enter into this new thing as we might into the depths of a mystery. And once you start with that, you're never really done. I'd come to school in order to study form, aesthetic form, the forms of poetry. What I wanted to do most, I thought, was to write about those modern poets who had practiced those forms best, to be their interpreter and their advocate, and of course, to try joining them in the making. This had once seemed important, not simply because I delighted in form, though I did, but because the perceiving of aesthetic form seemed to disclose something about reality. Good form said something about goodness. Poetic truth had something to do with truth in general. But what had I really been doing, I asked, those last few months? I wanted to study good poetry, sure, but what made a poem good? I read it as if it were a source of wisdom, true wisdom, or at least I thought I did. I heard in the back of my mind some wan Victorian voice lost in reverie and speaking of the immortal beauties of poetry. And sitting there in the sunlight, I thought, what makes a poem beautiful? And then you can't really interrupt yourself, can you? But if you can interrupt yourself, that's what I did. Excuse me, sir. What is beauty? And as I am now, so then, this question embarrassed me. It embarrassed me. If someone were to say the beauties of poetry, or is it beautiful, in a conversation, I thought, I would probably have smiled an indulgent smile and changed the subject. Beauty. But is beauty something to be smiled at? I'm going to argue today that it is, indeed, but not the way I then presumed. Certainly not with the condescension that I could feel rising in my throat. Let's talk about politics, sure. Let's talk about the uses to which ideas are put. But please, I thought then, let's not talk about ideas as if they were vessels of truth, or of beauty as if it were a reality unto itself, rather than somebody's lachrymose sentiment. But there was something wrong here, and I sensed it then. I sensed that beauty was no old word to be sniffed at, but I could not think of why. Intelligence in our day, after all, often wears the mask of disillusion and disenchantment. It had nothing to say about beauty. I often have to tell my students that it's not good enough to be smart, to be knowing. You have to be good enough to fall in love with things. I didn't know that then. It took me some time to figure out even how to begin thinking otherwise. When I finally did, it was under the name of being. Not too many of us study metaphysics in our school days. And I was soon made to see just how deeply that hurts and hinders us. When we try to make claims about the meaning of the world, we generally do so in a tentative and insecure fashion. And we do so because we fear this discontinuity between the fullness of thought and the ostensible barrenness of things. Our experience of the world may be rich indeed, but our confidence in the reality of that experience is watery and thin. The first great discovery I made in my studies was the deceptively simple claim that all our thoughts about things find foundation, stability, and rest only insofar as they can find expression in terms of being. Being is our word for everything that is real. And as Thomas Aquinas says, there is nothing that is real that is not being. My studies in literature had until then been hobbled by a failure to take this properly into account. Literature builds up imaginary worlds, ideal worlds sometimes, ficted worlds often enough. But its interest to us always derives from its relation to the real world. It became my ambition to think metaphysically, to think about literature and art in terms of being, knowing that only then could we see reality as it was, because only then were we asking, what's was? I turned to the old masters of the subject, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and in them I discovered the language of essence and existence, of matter and of form. And I sensed that these words had something to tell me, that they would bring clarity where frustrated incredulity had ruled before. They showed me, as did two other thinkers, the poet-critic Ivor Winters and Pope St. John Paul II, that knowledge of being was the only possible source of confidence in reason. Knowledge is not a contemptuous smile for the fancies of others, but an experience of the adequacy of one's thought, one's reason, to being as it really is. So I began to look for those occasions where the being of art seemed to demand consideration of being in general, when art touched not merely on life as we imagine it, but on that place of meeting between essence and existence. This issued first in a series of essays that considered what it means to speak of being as, this is not a philosophical word, but deep. If to be is, as Aquinas suggested, the act of existence and essence together, then just to be one thing entails not being reducible to one thing. Being is always a whole, greater than the sum of its parts. It is always more than itself. In the modern poets, as well as in the medieval and ancient philosophers, not to mention Dante, I found a wisdom, a vision of reality that could contain multitudes. Reality is not just the denuded substratum of matter, but the being of things in their depths. This, my authors told me. Those poets in whom I had been long interested, I soon saw for the first time it was just this insight that they were trying to honor with their words. They were trying in poem after poem, or in their work as a whole, to reveal the error of our unhappy tendency to reduce reality to raw stuff. In the work of the Irish poet Louis MacNeice, I found a man who liked Aristotle's vision of the world, but was afraid to embrace it, because he feared that life, after all, may be just an empty motion of limbs. In the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, of T.S. Eliot, of Winters and of Winters' disciple Helen Pinkerton, I found authors who were real authorities, that is, ones who wished to reveal our lives as fundamentally an immersion in existence, an encounter with being. But what was in that depth? It was the language of this word form that began to clarify things. The 20th century philosopher and disciple of Aquinas, from whom you heard just a few minutes ago, Jacques Maritain, sought to remind the world that to encounter being was to encounter a reality that can be known, and which can be known only because it has first been intelligibly formed. Form, as the ancients used that word, refers specifically to the intelligible essence of things. Some of you will remember your Plato. To know the truth is to gaze up at the intelligible forms, he says, that are the real source of everything in its particularized nature. If, therefore, form is partly constitutive of a thing, then that entails that truth is not just an idea up here in the mind, but a property woven into the fabric of reality. As the philosopher Louis Dupre once noted, this idea of form stands among the most ancient and odd claims of the classical world. If the truth is a form, if the truth is a shape, the truth appears. And you know this. When we know something, when we truly know it, what do we say? I see what you mean. I see the truth. Thinking over what that throwaway phrase might mean became my task next, and in fact, I'm not done. If you've ever read T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, and you remember if you have, you probably noticed an odd, maybe an irritating feature. This modernist poem tends to excite the indignation of its readers because, well, we have 434 lines of poetry, and they are accompanied by 6 densely wrought pages of endnotes furnished to us by the poet himself. Thank you, Mr. Eliot. Why? Those notes, I think, serve to reveal that hidden within the fragmentary, often obscure lines of the poem were meanings of which we might otherwise remain unaware. But what, I wondered, did it mean for a reader to say that the kind of being that a poem is one that has meaning hidden in it, or just meaning in it? In what sense could those footnotes pertain to the meaning of the poem? We might think of these questions, this question in reference to books more generally. I'll just give you an example. Those of you who don't like modernist poetry, this is for you people. If a copy of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice sits on my coffee table, where is its meaning then? When I open it, I find a novel about the making of a good marriage. When I close it, where does the plot go? If I point at the book and say, this is the great story of Achilles and the Trojan War, you will know I am wrong. Just spoiler alert, I would be. Maritain it was who gave me a way to speak about this. A thing is knowable only in terms of its form. A book, for instance, you won't be surprised to hear, is in the form of a book. But the meaning of the book exists in the book. Maritain went back into a minor text of Aquinas, and he found a term that is expressive of how the being of meaning can exist inside another being. The term he gave us is called intentional being. It is, Maritain tells us, intentional being that leaps into actuality as our eyes begin to scan a page. It's intentional being, moreover, that passes through the hand of the poet as he writes a line of verse. It's intentional being that passes through the brush of the painter. As the brush brings into being not just a canvas with paint on it, but a portrait of a lady. Hopkins writes in his sonnet, God's Grandeur, the following lines: "And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things, and though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings." What fascinates me about this poem is that he says, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things, and that this extends to being in general and to the particular kind of being that is a word. Here, for instance, that phrase, "Oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs." The morn, of a new day, the dawn of a new hope, expressed together with the color brown. Very neutral, inert, somewhat uninteresting word. Nobody's going to stop and say, how'd you come up with brown, Gerald? But then we think morning and brown, and we find hidden inside that phrase the words of another poet, the words of Shakespeare, the words of Horatio in Shakespeare's Hamlet. The first scene of that play, as you recall, after the ghost of Hamlet's father has disappeared with the passing of the watch, the good Horatio says, "But look, the morn in russet mantle clad walks o'er the dew of yon high eastward hill." And we say, well, that's pretty, but why should the morning walk over the eastern hills in a russet, that is to say, in a brown mantle? In the Gospel of St. John, we read the following short story of a more ancient dawning. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw in the tomb 2 white-robed angels, one sitting near the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni." In the light of Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene sees a stranger in humble dress, a brown mantle, no doubt. And so she takes him for the gardener. She speaks to him and does not know him. She speaks and she wakens and sees that the Christ lies hidden within the appearance of a rustic. And this encounter of Mary with Christ in his russet mantle at the dawn of a new day, indeed a new age, lies hidden within Hamlet and its tragic interlude of reckoning between faith and nothingness. And Hamlet dwells within Hopkins' sonnet, where the despair of the modern age is canceled out by a sudden flashing discovery of the depth of being and the superintending of a Holy Ghost. Things do not just exist. They do not just be. The dawn is always more than the morning. Things mean things. Intentional being lies stacked like print within the being of a book, waiting to be recognized. And so, being is also true. At the same time I was considering this, I was reading the work of the contemporary moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. Although he had little to say about being, he had a lot to say about a feature of it that's often obscured in our thinking. Moral thinking, MacIntyre argues, is impossible if we do not think in terms of the good to be attained. Ethics, as Aristotle first elaborated the field, entails inquiry after the nature of the good at which human life aims. And this good everyone calls happiness. We cannot properly know what is moral if we do not first know the nature of happiness and think in terms of it. MacIntyre's insight was in itself tremendously important. Oh, I still remember reading that book the first time. I think I'll go home and do it again. Well, I'll finish the talk first. Okay. But I slowly came to see it had also to be extended to being in general. We think of the full meaning of a work of literature as the good of the parts that makes its expression possible, And as we look out at the world, we see that we do not really understand things unless we know about them in terms of their final cause, their why, their end, their purpose, what they're good for. Imagine, for instance, trying to explain to someone what a hammer is without knowing what it's for. You couldn't. So follow me in a little logic, and this is a syllogism. First, if to understand things is to know they're good, and two, we do demonstrably understand things, then that entails that to know reality, to know being, to know the truth about being, is to perceive good in being, and being as known only in terms of its goodness. So reality is being, and being contains in its depths truth, indeed truth upon truth. And among those truths is the goodness of being itself. I began to see that so much of what draws us to literature is just this capacity to see the ordered wholes of lives leading to, sometimes attaining, sometimes failing, their intended good or purpose. This explains why so many authors down the centuries have thought the telling of stories to be a mode not just of instruction about events, that's history, but of moral instruction about events, about how they relate to one another, about how they form a plot, and how every plot concludes with a judgment in regard to some good. To know the truth, we have to know what things are good for. To know the truth about ourselves, we have to know what we're good for, and that entails knowing our story. To know our story is to see the form of our lives whole. So often we think of stories merely in terms of fictions, but this isn't right. Although we often tell fictions to ourselves, we arrive at self-knowledge just when we see the form of the true story of our lives and know it for the first time. Listen to that phrase just one more time. We see the form of the true story of our lives for the first time. It took me a long time to perceive the deepest mystery hidden there. To know is to see what? The truth, which is the form. This much I've already said. Form constitutes being. Everywhere there's reality, you will find form. And form is that which we know. The way in which reality gives itself to us, the way being gives itself to other being, is through its existent form. A being stands forth, and through its form, and because this is so, we may know things in themselves, and we may see things, know things, in their manifold relations to other things, as, for instance, a book relates to its meaning. Eliot's poem relates to its notes, a son to his mother and father, this day to the whole span of a life, a creature to his God. When we understand these things, we know them in themselves and in their relations. And when we perceive the whole, we apprehend something that may well have struck us with power and mystery long, long before, though we never knew what to make of it. When we encounter reality, I mean to say, we discover that being's capacity to give itself to other being is a great mystery. It is the mystery, in fact, and it is what has always been comprehended under the name of beauty. The classical definition of beauty speaks of the splendor of truth, wherein truth is a form whose radiance gives itself to make things real and to be known by other beings. And so we hear of beauty as the splendor of form, or just plain old form and splendor. To see these things is to perceive, to receive the form of things existing in themselves, and also to perceive their splendor, their harmonious attachments of the particular to the whole, in the visible mystery of the real. The true mystery of the world is not that it should contain some beauty, but that beauty should be the cause of the world. It is the gift, the gratuity, that lets the world to give itself in being, and that stirs the mind in wonder and off on the search for truth, and the person to pursue what is genuinely good. So here, at last, was an explanation of what had been a mere experience before, but a powerful experience. For it had led me to read literature, to take delight in art, and to begin to write poetic forms. Beauty is that which discloses the being of a thing as formed. Reality is known by its forms, and so the work of art is a form that draws attention to itself precisely so that through its form we can encounter the splendor of being and truth. This is what I struggled to learn, and in retrospect, it explains an awful lot. Why I've spent 2 decades hacking away at poems, trying to bring words into some permanent form for their own sake and for what they can reveal to us about the nature of things. Why I have, sometimes a bit caustically, I admit, sought to defend the writing of good poems in the face of all those contemporary figures who would seek to dissever form from splendor, art from life, beauty from truth, or intellect from being, who would have us think reality a mere poverty of atoms. Such was my labor in the book, The Fortunes of Poetry in an Age of Unmaking. And this is why, at last, I sat down to write a book called The Vision of the Soul, Truth, Goodness, and Beauty in the Western Tradition. There, I tried to gather and to distill what I'd had to search out and cobble together over many years. And I did this so that some future young student may not find himself at ease on a Sunday afternoon, delighting in the beauty of some bright page, only to startle himself with a blush of shame, thinking that beauty is a word only for those who do not know enough to reject it. To the contrary, it is the word for reality that keeps giving and will not cease in giving. And in the face of such a gift, what can we do but smile? Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful. And we have just a few minutes before we have to adjourn to have a little conversation, and we like to do that with our Hiett Prize winners. I have a copy of your book. It's thick, and it's good. I encourage you to get it. So, as I say, the few minutes we have left, a couple of leading questions, I hope. You speak of tradition a lot in your book, and you call it a birthright, an heirloom. Love those words. And you're troubled by a modernist tendency to feel, and I'm quoting from the book now, every inheritance as an unforgivable injustice. Do that? Every inheritance as an unforgivable injustice. Does tradition need safeguarding? And if it does, how do we do that? Or maybe I'm asking, what in your understanding is the essence of that heirloom that is the Western tradition?
Well, tradition in general, and I referred to Alistair McIntyre in my talk, and it was his work that helped clarify this for me. We tend to think of tradition as a series of discrete objects, like dumbbells, that weigh upon us, and sometimes we like the weight and sometimes we don't. But that's probably not the most accurate way to think about a tradition. A tradition is more like a language. If you have inherited the language of English, then you can speak. If you have not, then you can't. So if we don't think of traditions as like the words of a language or like a language, we don't understand that they are what makes it possible for us to function and flourish and to gain some purchase on the truth in the world. So our age is one that tends to claim a kind of absolute freedom for itself, and so it resists tradition as if it were merely an imposition, rather than embracing it as what it makes possible functioning and flourishing in the first place. And there's several ways you can try to conserve such a tradition or defend such a tradition, and there are more ways to go wrong than right. If you think about, say, the experience of the French with their language, having a French academy that formally judges whether a word can be admitted into the language isn't going to work too well, as they learned in the late 90s. The only way to conserve anything is not to preserve it or to guard it or to fence it off, though, as Robert Frost said, good fences do make good neighbors. You have to just make things flourish. You have to cultivate and develop them. So the best way to defend a tradition is to embrace it, practice it, and show to the world why it's something that the rest of the world needs too.
Thank you. Speaking of voting words into the official canon of the language, several years ago, Merriam-Webster voted the word truthiness as the word of the year. Right? I think that was coined first by Stephen Colbert, one of our leading intellectuals. So, and you speak and write freely about the importance of truth. You've just been talking to us in your own quest. I don't think you mean the word in the way we see it tossed about today in terms of an opposition to fake news or truthiness and things like that. So how are we to, ferret our way through this maze of the uses of the word truth?
I have used the word truthiness in a lecture. I was trying to explain the aesthetics of the German idealist philosopher Immanuel Kant, and I said that beauty for Kant is something that gives you truthiness with no actual truth and goodiness with no actual good. So thank you, Dr. Colbert. I'm sorry, I lost the question. Oh, yes. I hope this came across in like my comments today. If I was just complaining about how we think about traditions, but I'm going to complain about how we tend to think about truth. We tend to think of truth as a personal possession. So I have even heard someone say, "My truth." And I thought, my bone. Truth. The intellectual life is impossible if truth is a personal possession and if the truth is something that, say, subsists in your head. One of the great beauties of the account of the intellectual life that Plato and Aristotle gave us is that the one who wants to know the truth is the one who wants to stand at the feet of truth and gaze up in awe and wonder, which is why we don't strive to just have the truth. We strive to be philosophers, lovers of wisdom. And in our age, we tend to think of truth in an incoherent and materialist way that identifies it as a subjective or a ideological possession, rather than as this great light at whose feet we stand and which we receive as a gift.
Thank you. I wish we could continue, but we're out of time. Maybe one more. One last one. The volume of your collected poems is Some Permanent Things. You're going to be reading from that tonight and reciting from it. So the buzzwords of our day, change, disruption, chaos, would seem to attack the very idea of permanence, that there's nothing permanent. Your title puts me in mind of a frequent theme of poetry, though. For example, Shakespeare's familiar Sonnet 18, with its faith in the permanence of art. In this instance, the poem itself that he's writing. So here are the last lines. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. and this gives life to thee. So what do you consider some permanent things?
Oh, you mean what lasts forever?
What do you mean by permanent things?
Oh, okay. Well, so that title comes from a throwaway note at the back of Eliot's book, The Idea of a Christian Society. But it was a throwaway note, but then the great Michigan political philosopher Russell Kirk embraced it, and he published a book called Enemies of the Permanent Things, and it indicates the term is supposed to comprehend all of those aspects of a tradition that are, you might call, orienting points. So truth, goodness, and beauty are good orienting points, and you think, well, that doesn't tell you much. Well, some people had to work awfully hard to think that truth, goodness, and beauty are really important words. So I thought that was a great lesson when I first heard those words said together. The permanent truths, or the permanent things, are those insights we learn about the nature of reality and about human destiny and what we were made to become by our nature and by our Creator. And then there are those semi-permanent things, those things that eventually can be blown away. But of course, it's that huge structure that we build up that's called a culture. And that everything we make that becomes part of a culture is our effort to render permanent, to draw a little nearer to God, the everyday facets of our life.
And you say that culture, quote, is an art of the beautiful. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. Oh, there's more. Yeah.
Very,
The scholar Philip Reef, who's kind of hard to understand, but I've done my best to understand him. He said something that just struck me as so brilliant and so absolutely true, which is that every culture is an interpretation in the temporal realm of our perception of what we think is in the eternal realm. So it's an attempt to translate, to give form to, temporal form, to what is most permanent and lasting.
Nice. Thank you very much, James, for all of that. Thank you so much. So, and now for the award itself, we're going to stand here, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Jaina Sangha and ask her to come to the stage to present the Hiett Prize for this year. Dr. Sangha Jaina is a fellow of the Dallas Institute, a member of its board of directors, and a widely published award-winning author. She's published a novel, a volume of short stories, and recently 2 novellas. And she has been awarded a number of prestigious residencies. She's a star at the Dallas Institute, and she's very much a part of our lives. So, Jaina, please come and present the award.
Just 2 quick things, James. Your work has so much light and heat and grace. And I congratulate you for that. And just another thing is that with this award, whether you like it or not, you are now connected to the Dallas Institute and to the city of Dallas. So with congratulations and with high hopes.